If learning Autodesk Inventor feels a little overwhelming to you when you look at complex parts or look at all of the options that are up here and all of the menus and all of the things you can do, well, I've got 7 tips for you today that will help you get off to a good start without getting overwhelmed by all of the things that Inventor can do. That gets me to tip number 1 is to start simple. Learn quickly by learning slowly. You don't need to dive into your first part with something like this. You need to start with something like this. Simple shapes, simple extrusions. Keep it simple. Learn the basics, master the basics, and add new tools gradually. So where do you need to focus your efforts when you begin? That is tip number 2. You need to focus on sketching and extruding. There's a whole lot that Inventor can do, but if you start with these 2 basics, you will build a good foundation that will support you as you learn all of these other things up here. We're going to start a 2D sketch, put it on a plane. Let's use a 2-point center rectangle. Create a rectangle, right click, say OK, add some dimensions, make that 2 inches, make that 1.5. Finish that sketch. You draw a rectangle, it turns into a block. You sketch on that block again. You create a new sketch. Let's use a circle this time. Draw a circle and give it a diameter. Let's make that 1 inch. We can finish that sketch. We can extrude that shape, cut it through that part. So keep it simple. Practice extruding and sketching over and over and over again. If you can't sketch what you want, then you can't create the parts that you want. Extrusions are easy, and the rest of this becomes a lot easier if you can create a good sketch. So what is a good sketch? That leads me into the next point. Let's create a sketch on the bottom of this part as we introduce tip number 3, which is start using constraints. I know a lot of people have trouble with constraints and are afraid of constraints, but let's just take a quick look at what constraints can do for you. These 4 lines, 2 problems. They do not form a closed profile because these ends do not meet, and it is also kind of sloppy. These lines are not perfectly horizontal and vertical. That's where constraints come in. I can use a coincident constraint to close up this corner. I can use a horizontal constraint to get this top line horizontal. Let's click on the bottom line. See, it was already horizontal. Let's look at these side lines over here. I can make that vertical, and it was already aligned with this other side, and that one jumped into vertical as well. There's a whole lot you can do with constraints, and we're not going to go into great detail here. I just want to give you that quick demonstration that you can use constraints to get your geometry to look the way that you want it to. And after you do that, when you get your constraints where you want them, then it's easier to come in and add dimensions to get everything in place where you want it. The constraints get things lined up and squared up the way you want them to, but then you can come in with dimensions and get everything in the right place. Now we can see that that rectangle has turned black. It tells us our sketch is fully constrained, and we can finish that sketch and extrude it. Let's make a cut all the way through that part. But now that we have made that cut, I want to go back and look at some things we did in this sketch, and that gets us to tip number 4, and that is understanding a little bit about using parameters. I have 4 dimensions up on this part, and I made all of them a 1/4 inch, 0.250. These dimensions are not just static dimensions. They are not just one thing that exists only in this place. These dimensions are parameters. Look at what it says here. This is dimension D8. It is stored in memory of this part as D8. If I come up here to the Manage tab and look at the parameters, see, here is a list. Here is all of the dimensions that I have used in this part so far. And don't worry too much about this list right now. That's not really the point I want to make. But what you do need to know, and what is very useful when you're getting started, is to know that if this dimension that I put on is 250, I can take this one here, that was D7, and I can tell it be equal to that other dimension. That is now tying these two together. Let's see why this matters. Let's make all four of them be equal to that first dimension right there. What does that do for me? That means if I come in here and change this dimension to make it an 1/8 inch, 0.125, then all of them change together. Whatever I change that number to, all of them update to be equal to that one parameter. And that is a lot simpler than having to type in the same dimension over and over and over again. Let's look at something else though that we can do using parameters. Let's just start a new file for this one. Again, start a new sketch, pick a plane. I'm going to draw a rectangle again, leave it out here. Let's put a width on this one of 6 inches. Suppose I want the height of this rectangle to always be equal to half of that width. Well, as I add a dimension to this one, I can, while it's highlighted, click on this dimension. Notice it picks up D0, and I just say divided by 2. I want to take that original dimension, divide it by 2, and then the height of this rectangle is always going to be half of the width. I can come back in and change this one. If I change it to 12, now the height is 6. So I can finish that. I can then extrude that and create my solid block. Now let's open up some other parts that I have already created to take a look at tip number 5. Tip number 5 is design with intent. I want to look at these two parts that are drawn exactly the same, or at least they look exactly the same. We've got one in gray and one in blue just so we can tell them apart. And while these two parts look exactly the same, I want to make a point about the way that they are drawn. Both of them start with a 3 inch by 1.5 inch rectangle. That is the same on both of them. But now I want to look at how we got the rest of those features in there. The second extrusion is this square that goes through the middle. And in this sketch, I drew that square right on top of the origin of the part. The original sketch, the original rectangle, was drawn on top of the part origin and that sketch origin. And then this one as well was drawn right on top of that origin. What is that going to do for me? That means that no matter what happens to the size of this original rectangle, if I go in here and change those two numbers, that square is going to stay right in the middle. If I go over to this one and look at how I placed the square on this one, I put that square 1.5 inches off one side and 3/4 of an inch off the other side, which just happens to be, let's look at the original sketch, that's half of each of those numbers. So that's going to put it right in the middle. But if these numbers get changed, let's do what we did on the other part. If I change those numbers, now that rectangle or that square does not stay right in the middle of my rectangular part. It moves and it does not keep up with what I intend for this part. It does not keep up with my design intent, which is to keep the square right in the middle of the part. Now I would have to go back in and make these changes anytime that original rectangle got changed to get it back in the middle. Now see what happened when I moved that square. Now these holes did not move with it either. Let's go back to the good part. Look at how I dimensioned these hole points. I put each of these points 1 inch off center, used the parameters as well. Put the first one 1 inch to the left, and then when I created that second dimension, I made it reference that first dimension so that no matter what I do here, they will update together. I want them to be dimensioned from the center of that square. I want them to both be the same distance from that center. So I use my parameters to control my design intent. So no matter what happens to the size of the rectangle, no matter what I do to this dimension, then I keep my intent of having that square right in the middle of the part and these two holes centered around that square in the center. The way this one was dimensioned, I dimensioned these off of the edge, and while it originally worked the way that I had that part drawn to start with, now if I want to make changes, I've got to figure out what all of these numbers need to be and what those dimensions have to be from the edge of the part. Using constraints and parameters wisely as you draw will help you control design intent. There's a whole lot of things, again, that we can talk about with design intent. There will be videos on that. But I just want you to, as you draw, as you design, think about what it is you want the part to actually do. What do you want it to actually be? Let's do one more quick demonstration just to kind of make that point. Let's create a new sketch. Let's draw a square. Let's make this 3 by 3. Draw this square. Finish that sketch. Create a quick extrusion. Let's just leave it at 1 inch thick. And let's draw a new sketch on the front of this. And suppose I want to cut away most of this block, and I want to just leave this little L-shaped piece. Think about what matters. I know the whole thing is 3 inches wide, and if I want a 1/2 inch wide leg here, does it make more sense to come over here and dimension that at 2.5 inches? Or does it make more sense to dimension the part that actually matters and make that dimension be a 1/2 inch? And again, using my parameters, if I know I want these to both be a 1/2 inch all the time, then I can make one dimension reference the other one. So whatever changes, they change together. That is the power of using constraints, using parameters, keeping design intent in mind as you draw, and so that if I go back in and change this because I decide I want this dimension now to be 4 inches, then I keep that consistent width all the way through. Now I'm going to open up a third part that I have created that again looks just like those other two, but we want to look at something that is not done as well on this part as the others. If we look at this piece again, it looks just like the other ones, or at least it looks like they did when they started. I'm going to close this without saving and open it back up. There, now we have them matching again. I have these two parts again that look just alike. The gray one, that is the original, and this one that's going to be our example of something not to do, and this is going to lead us into tip number 6. And tip number 6 is to use one sketch per feature. What do I mean by that? Look at the good part that I have here. I have an extrusion that is the outside. I have an extrusion that is that square through the middle. And then I have a hole feature that puts those two holes in. And this one, look, I only have one extrusion. Let's look at the sketch for that extrusion. There I have everything all in one sketch that was used to create this single extrusion. Now this may seem like a nice, clean, efficient way to do it. I can get everything in one sketch. I only have to create one extrusion. So what is wrong with this approach? So let's go back to the good part and take a look at what we have. I have this first extrusion. I can name this first extrusion. Let's call it body. I can name this second extrusion. Let's call it square. We'll call it square cut, and we'll leave hole as hole because we only have the one hole feature in this part. Now if I have drawn this part sometime in the past and I come back and I want to see it and I want to edit it, what makes more sense to somebody coming and trying to figure out what this part is doing and how they can update and modify this part? Here all I have is one extrusion, one sketch, everything is in one place. This may not seem like a big deal on this part, but as we get more complex, if we were to add more features to this part, if we had other extrusions that came along on top of it, let's make that one cut all the way through the part. Not a good fully constrained sketch, but it illustrates our point. If we have a few features in this extrusion in this sketch, and we got another feature in this sketch, it's hard to go back and find and modify each feature that you might need to access. If we do it this way, then I always know that this is the body, that's the square cut through it, that's the hole, and it's easier to come back and modify each one of those when I need to. Now let's wrap this up with tip number 7, and tip number 7 is simply to practice. Practice, redraw, redo, do these things over and over again. If we look at the part that we were just considering, that little rectangular block, even if you go through a tutorial on something like that one time and you see how it's done and you walk through that tutorial, go back and do it again, watch it again. You need to be able to recreate what it was that you just saw. There are tiny building blocks to this. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. It is simply one piece at a time, one thing at a time. Learn to sketch, learn to use the features that are here. Learn to add constraints. I missed that one. I'm going to go back and put it on. But follow along with the tutorial, whether it's mine or anybody else's, and do these things over and over again. Find tutorials that match your skill level. Again, let's go back to this first part that we started with. If you are new to Inventor, don't go to a tutorial for a part that looks like this. You go and you follow along on a part that looks more like this. To learn the basics, practice those skills over and over again, and then you can grow and you can learn and you can build more skills, building on top of what you already know. Once you have a solid foundation in sketching, extruding, and adding and using more and more of these features, everything that you learn will become easier and easier, and you will be able to do all the things that you need to do in Inventor. I do have playlists already loaded with some of these topics, and there are more videos always coming, so check out the links on the screen or in the description. Subscribe to this channel so you can always come back and find these tutorials as you need them. If you're still here, now would be a great time to hit the like button. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.